In the small town of Asako, spread between the rolling hills of Ghana's Ashanti region, everyone knew Kwabena Darko. If there was one thing that set him apart, it was his defiance. Kwabena Darko was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, his skin darkened by the relentless sun, and his voice deep enough to command a room. But what truly made him infamous was his relentless disbelief in anything beyond what his eyes could see. To Kwabena, the world was as simple as the earth beneath his feet and the sky above his head. He believed in hard work and money, nothing more, nothing less. Why should I fear what I cannot see? He would often ask anyone who dared to speak to him about the supernatural or religion. These gods and spirits you all fear so much, they are just stories to keep you in line. There is nothing there. The townsfolk had long given up on trying to convince him otherwise. Even the village elders, who were revered for their wisdom, shook their heads and spat out saliva whenever Kwabena was brought up in conversation. But Kwabena didn't care. His stubbornness had earned him a reputation that he wore like a badge of honor. One hot afternoon, during a village festival dedicated to the river god, Osuoya, the people of Asako gathered at the town square and moved to the river bank. The traditional priests, clad in black and white, were performing rituals, chanting incantations to honor the spirits. It was a sacred event, one that the townspeople took seriously. But not Kwabena. He would go to farm on such sacred days. He would go to junctions, and eat foods that were served to the gods. This time Kwabena went extra mile in disregarding the sacred events, as the head priest lifted a calabash filled with palm wine, ready to pour libation to the gods. Kwabena lunged forward, snatched the calabash, and bolted down the dusty road. Gasps filled the air as everyone watched him disappear into the nearby forest. "Oh! Kwabena, the head priest, Komfo Tutu," shouted after him, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You have brought upon yourself the wrath of the spirits. Return the drink at once." But Kwabena was already gone, laughing as he hid behind a large mahogany tree. He drank the palm wine in large gulps, the sweet liquid sliding down his throat. When the calabash was empty, he tossed it aside, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and smacked. "Spirits. If they exist, let them come for me. I am not even satisfied next time they should make it 2 calabashes," he muttered to himself. Word of Kwabena's audacity spread quickly through the town. Mothers whispered to their children to avoid him, elders shook their heads in dismay, and the priests began to worry that his actions would anger the gods. His name was not even mentioned in households, but Kwabena was unfazed. He continued his rebellious acts, each more brazen than the last. He just wanted to prove to people that there was nothing there. He marched into shrines and smashed the sacred figurines that were believed to house powerful spirits. "Where are you now, Ho?" he would taunt, his voice echoing in the empty shrines. "If you're real, show yourself." He once slapped one fetish priest who tried to prevent him from smashing the sacred figurines. The fetish priest broke out crying and cursed Kwabena. He ate meats that were classified as abomination in Asako and even went ahead to kick the sacred python that was known to the villagers as the son of the river goddess. The people of Asako were terrified. No one dared approach him, and even the pastors who preached in the local churches avoided him. But Kwabena didn't care. In fact, he reveled in their fear. One Sunday morning, as the church bells rang and the congregation gathered to worship, Kwabena stood outside the church, arms crossed over his chest. "You're all wasting your time," he called out to the people entering the church. "There's no God listening to your prayers. Go home and do something useful with your day." The pastor, Reverend Mensah, paused at the entrance, his Bible clutched tightly in his hand. He looked at Kwabena with a mix of pity and concern. "Kwabena, my brother, why do you harden your heart so much? God's love is real, and His power." "Spare me your sermons, Reverend," Kwabena interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "If your God is so powerful, let Him strike me down right here and now. I learned He has a son, let Him come, I will beat him hands down." Reverend Mensah sighed deeply and entered the church, praying silently for Kwabena. Days turned into weeks, and Kwabena continued his reign of disbelief. The town began to wonder if perhaps he was right. Nothing had happened to him despite his blatant disrespect for the spiritual world. But then, one fateful night, everything changed. It was a moonless night, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. Kwabena was returning home from a local bar, having drunk more than his fill of akpeteshi, a local alcoholic drink. His steps were unsteady as he stumbled through the narrow path leading to his house on the outskirts of town. As he neared the old abandoned shrine he had desecrated weeks ago, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The air seemed to grow colder, and the sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the darkness. Kwabena shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that had gripped him. "Nonsense," he muttered to himself. "It's just the drink playing tricks on me." But then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kwabena froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned around slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Show yourself if you are a man like me." The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the rustling of leaves. Kwabena's breath quickened as he backed away, his eyes darting around wildly. Then, out of the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, staring directly at him. Kwabena's legs turned to jelly as he stumbled backward, his back hitting the rough bark of a tree. The creature emerged from the shadows, a massive black dog, its fur bristling, and its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It bared its teeth, revealing sharp, glistening fangs that looked like they could tear through flesh with ease. Kwabena's mind raced. This couldn't be real. There was no such thing as spirits, no supernatural creatures. But the dog was there, advancing slowly toward him, its growl growing louder and more menacing. "Stay back!" Kwabena shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm not afraid of you." But his words rang hollow in the empty night. The dog lunged at him, and Kwabena scrambled to the side, barely avoiding its snapping jaws. He stumbled and fell to the ground, his heart pounding in his ears. The dog circled him, its eyes never leaving his. For the first time in his life, Kwabena felt true, paralyzing fear. This was no ordinary animal, there was something otherworldly about it, something that defied all his beliefs. As the dog lunged at him again, Kwabena screamed out and called upon Onumi, raising his arms to shield himself. But just as the creature was about to reach him, it stopped. The air around them grew thick with an unseen force, and the dog's eyes seemed to dim. It backed away slowly, its growl fading into a whimper. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. Kwabena lay on the ground, trembling and drenched in sweat and urine. His mind was reeling. What had just happened? Was it a dream? But the claw marks on the ground, the scent of the dog's fur lingering in the air, they were real. As he staggered to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady, Kwabena knew that his life would never be the same. Something had changed that night, something deep within him. For the first time, he doubted himself. And that doubt began to gnaw at him, slowly unraveling the certainty he had always clung to. Kwabena looked up at the sky, his heart still pounding. "Is this your way of showing me you're real?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the night. The silence that followed was deafening, but in that silence, Kwabena felt a presence, a force that he had never believed in but could no longer deny. He slowly began to walk back to his house, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. He knew he couldn't tell anyone about what had happened, who would believe him? But deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning. The spirits he had challenged were not done with him yet. And as Kwabena entered his house and locked the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The once proud and defiant Kwabena now found himself trembling in fear, haunted by the very things he had spent his life denying. And as he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, he realized that he was no longer in control. The spirits had shown themselves, and now, they were the ones calling the shots. The days following that terrifying night were nothing short of a nightmare for Kwabena. The once fearless man had become a shadow of himself. His shoulders, once broad with pride, now slumped with an invisible weight. His confident stride was replaced with a nervous shuffle, and the loud, mocking voice that used to taunt the villagers was now quiet, as if Kwabena was afraid to speak too loudly lest he attract the attention of unseen forces. The people of Aseko noticed the change immediately. Whispers spread like wildfire through the town. "Did you see Kwabena? He looks like he's seen a ghost. Maybe the spirits finally taught him a lesson. Serves him right after all he's done." But no one dared confront him directly. Fear of what might be following him kept them at a distance. Kwabena himself was haunted by that night. The glowing eyes, the growl that seemed to come from the depth of the earth, he couldn't shake the memory, no matter how hard he tried. Every night, he would bolt his doors and windows, clutching a cutlass under his pillow, praying to a god he had never believed in that the creature wouldn't return. One night the cutlass nearly cut his neck because he forgot he had placed it. Days turned into weeks, and Kwabena grew more paranoid with each passing day. He avoided the forest, refused to go near any shrines, and even stopped attending the local bar, where he used to boast of his disbelief. His world had shrunk to the confines of his small, dimly lit house. But the spirits of Aseko had not forgotten him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town settled into its usual quiet, Kwabena sat alone in his room, staring at the walls. He hadn't been able to sleep properly for days, and the exhaustion was taking its toll. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him, the darkness creeping into his mind. Suddenly, there was a knock on his door. Kwabena's heart leaped into his throat. He hadn't had any visitors since that night. Who could it be at this hour? "Kwabena, are you there?" a familiar voice called from outside. Kwabena let out a sigh of relief. It was Akwasi, his childhood friend. Akwasi had been the one person in Aseko who had never given up on Kwabena, despite his antics. He had tried, time and again, to get Kwabena to change his ways, but his pleas had always fallen on deaf ears. Kwabena hesitated for a moment, then slowly got up and unlocked the door. Akwasi stepped in, his eyes scanning the room with concern. "Kwabena, what happened to you? You look different," Akwasi said cautiously. Kwabena managed a weak smile. "Nothing, just been thinking a lot." "Thinking? You?" Akwasi chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. But when he saw the look in Kwabena's eyes, his smile faded. "Come on, tell me what's really going on." Kwabena sat down heavily on a wooden stool, his hands trembling slightly. "Akwasi, I've seen things. Things that I can't explain. Things that shouldn't exist." Akwasi's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Kwabena swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. He had never admitted to anyone what had happened that night, but he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He recounted the events of that terrifying night, the black dog, the glowing eyes, the feeling of an unseen force that had nearly consumed him. Akwasi listened in stunned silence, his eyes wide with shock. When Kwabena finished, there was a long pause. "Kwabena, this is serious," Akwasi finally said, his voice low. "You've angered the spirits. You need to make amends." Kwabena looked down at his hands, shame and fear warring within him. How? How do I fix this?" Akwasi stood up, determination in his eyes. "We need to go to the village elders. They can guide us. But you have to be willing to humble yourself, Kwabena. This isn't something you can just brush off." For the first time in his life, Kwabena felt truly humbled. He nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. Maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. The next morning, Kwabena and Akwasi made their way to the home of Komfo Tutu, the head priest. The old man was sitting outside his compound, his face etched with the wisdom of many years. When he saw Kwabena approaching, his expression turned stern. "Kwabena Dako," Komfo Tutu said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You have caused much trouble in this town. What brings you here today?" Kwabena lowered his head, unable to meet the priest's gaze. "Nana, I've come to seek forgiveness. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I need your help." Komfo Tutui studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The spirits are not quick to forgive, Kwabena. But they are just. If you are sincere, they may grant you mercy. Kwabena felt a wave of relief wash over him. He would do whatever it took to make amends, to free himself from the grip of fear that had taken hold of his life. Over the next few days, Kwabena went through a series of rituals under the guidance of Komfo Tutu and the other priests. He offered sacrifices at the shrines he had desecrated. He was stripped naked and carried a pot around the market square. He poured libations to the spirits he had mocked, and prayed to the gods he had denied for so long. Each ritual was a step toward healing, not just for Kwabena, but for the entire town of Asako. But even as he went through the motions, Kwabena couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The memory of that night haunted him, a constant reminder that the supernatural world was very real and very dangerous. One evening, as Kwabena was returning home from the shrine, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows near his house. His heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall and shrouded in darkness, but there was something familiar about it. As he approached cautiously, the figure stepped into the light. Kwabena gasped. He nearly ran back. It was the same black dog that had terrorized him that night, but now it seemed different. Its eyes were no longer burning with fire, instead, they were calm, almost sad. Kwabena froze, unsure of what to do. The dog stared at him for a long moment, then slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Kwabena stood there, shaken but strangely at peace. He didn't know what the encounter meant, but he felt as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. From that day on, Kwabena changed. He no longer mocked the beliefs of others, no longer taunted the spirits or dismissed the power of the unseen. He even joined the local church and was part of their Sunday school teachers. He became a humble man, one who respected the traditions of his people and sought to live in harmony with the world around him. The town of Asako, too, changed. The people saw in Kwabena a living example of the consequences of pride and disbelief, and they became more devout in their practices. The village thrived, its people united in their respect for the spiritual world. As for Kwabena, he never spoke of that night again. But he carried the memory with him, a silent reminder that there were forces in the world beyond his understanding. And though he had once dared the spirits to challenge him, he now knew better than to tempt fate. And so, life in Asako returned to its quiet rhythm, the town at peace once more. But in the shadows, in the places where the light didn't reach, the spirits watched, waiting, always waiting, for they knew that in the world of men, there would always be those who doubted, those who defied. And the spirits, they never forgot.